All right, here. Sounds like I think we're live. Get started in a few minutes. What is it? 11:53. So we got some time. We'll get started in just a few minutes here. There's another one. I'm just getting a few news articles here. All right. I think I have my producer online. Let me check here. Hey, Becca. Put you on here. I'm streaming you. How about just your audio? Let's see here. Okay, you're muted as well. Oh, you're on that call. All right. Thank you for doing the logo for us. So I guess we'll get started in like 2 minutes. My producer Becca Refford is on the phone. She's online monitoring this while she's on a support call. But we're going to be starting up at noon. And if you have any questions, you want to make some comments, please do. I have a chat line here that should pick up everything that's on YouTube. And if not, we'll figure that out. I think Becca's off the phone now. Okay. And other than that, we'll get started in just a second. Okay, we'll get started here. Just about a second. It's Tech Chat Tuesdays. Now that's gonna be something I'll have to work on how to say. Thank you for joining me. This is episode 3, and we're going to talk today about tools. Our goal here at this show is to bring up different things that we want to talk about technology-wise. It's kind of like my forum for shooting the hay with people. That is not a word. That is not a phrase. I have no idea what that is. But anyway, talk tech. And so this week, I kind of had a little bit of a dry spot for new topics. So I thought it would be a good idea to talk about some, developer tools that we'd use day to day. Before we do, though, let me bring up a couple things. So first of all, you can join us on this if you go to the YouTube channel for Chariot Solutions. Google Chariot Solutions on YouTube and bring up the YouTube channel. We'll put up a link at some point during this to what the actual address is for people who are picking up next time. But you can, the typical like and subscribe. You can go ahead and click on the like and click the little bell to be subscribed to it so you can be updated when we do another live broadcast or have another updated video. Beyond that, let's do a little bit of developer news. So let me bring that stuff up here. I'm a big fan, actually, and I found this from another developer friend years ago when I was attending a conference, but I'm a big fan of this website, Hack URLs. So if you're ever, let's see here, get that thing up there, share screen. There we go, live. Hack URLs. So I'm a big fan of this thing. It's just a nice aggregation of news from a bunch of different sources. They even have a little web service if you want to look at it in text. You can do a wget on it, the ASCII version. And so I just pull a few things out of this once in a while. It keeps me up to date if I just want a really quick view of what's going on tech-wise. So a couple things I pulled out of here. First of all, HTTP, a command line HTTP client for the API era. And this is really kind of interesting. So this tool gives you the ability to do HTTP calls, work with JSON, deal with sessions back and forth, different things that run. Really interesting little open source tool. It's a relatively straightforward thing to install, and then you can start doing, web service calls to it. HTTP IE.org, HTTP. That was kind of interesting. Another one I came up with from this list is Ireland Health Services has open sourced their COVID tracker app. In case you're curious how they're processing the data and how they're doing things, they opened the whole app up on GitHub. So if you'd like to see, like what the app looks like, what services they have in here, the APIs they're offering. Looks like they're running TypeScript, probably Node, something like that, I would guess. That is all available to you, and that's on github.com/HSE Ireland/COVID-tracker- app. Kind of interesting. So you can see what's going on as people are trying to get a hold on the data that's being sent in about COVID-19. Give you some sample code to look at for that. Another completely left turn here. I thought this was kind of cute. Don't know that I would use this for anything, but I thought it was interesting that someone spent the time to put together a Python 3 implementation for client-side web programming. That clock on the right here is written in a language called Python, browser Python. So kind of cute, interesting. It's probably 100 times slower for operations than pure native JavaScript. So keep that in mind. It's probably better for experimentation, hacking around a little bit. But they've got lots of demos on here. Like if you want to see let's see, rotating an element. All right, there's a little piece of code that does that. You can see the Python syntax. There's a browser library they have. You can get to the HTML. You can do DOM manipulation. And so that's what this thing is. Interesting tool. Again, it is not the fastest thing in the world. When I was playing around with things on it, it was a little slow. But the interesting thing is that you basically mount your scripts as type text Python in your page. So if you really like Python and you're learning web stuff and you just want to hack around, Brython.info there's a nice little tutorial on there and lots of samples. You can see there's all sorts of things like access to WebSockets and web workers and SVG access and things like that. So could be a fun thing. I wouldn't make it my next single page app client, but it is a fun tool to play around with. And I thought that was kind of fun. Okay, that's about it for the dev news for this week. So let's jump into the next topic, which is tools. And wanted to start off with a couple of just overall level setting things. First of all, these are tools that I like to use and tools that people on the teams that I work on like to use. They're not proscriptive. I'm not expecting this to be something like this is a definitive list. And the goal here would be hopefully to get some comments and thoughts from other people about what they're doing as well. And so Becca, if you're there, if you throw things into the Slack chat, if they come up, I'm not sure. Maybe we could do something there in case I don't get them here. But first off, there's a lot of people doing virtualization and have been doing for years. And if we start off with what you would think is kind of like the old and staid way of doing things, it actually can be quite useful. You can get a laptop with 64 gigs of RAM or 32 gigs of RAM and terabytes of disk space these days. So if you have that kind of workstation, you might want to consider virtualizing all your projects onto VMware VirtualBox instances. I have a good friend of mine here at Chariot who works on VirtualBox for all his projects. Has a Linux instance, and he just creates multiple smaller Linux instances to isolate things. And it's relatively straightforward. You can back up all the images. You certainly have no app bloat. And you can pick up all those VMs and move them to another computer, which is kind of nice if you're kind of deciding to move on to another machine. Now, the cons for that would be things like you'd have to set up a good starter VM to work with, unless you want to always start by installing Ubuntu. And provisioning can take time. So if you're doing a lot of one-off experiments, this is probably not the way to go, or maybe you have an experiments VM for that. But if you can also use things like Ansible and Chef and Puppet and things like that to build things up. But those tools all obviously take some effort and time to set up. And then switching projects basically means switching over from server to server. So having a lot of RAM is useful here, and having a nice fast SSD so you can kind of keep a snapshot of what's going on in one VM as you passivate it to move on to the next one is really useful. So as people are still using this, and as machines get larger, this is certainly a viable option. If you take that and you move it off into virtualization, you could put these on instances in the cloud. So EC2, for example, or whatever virtual machines are in Azure. The pros there is that, you can create a centralized server or development environment and load it up with whatever software you want to and offer it to groups of people. All right, I'm back. Sorry, I don't know what happened there. So I don't know where I was. Hey, Becca, I have to ask you a question here, producer extraordinaire. Where did I stop at the EC2 instances part? Oh, now she's off. Things are happening. Things are happening. Oh, here we go. If I add you to the stream, there we go. No, I can't hear you. Technical difficulty station. Okay. Anyway, I'm just going to start over with the EC2 instances talk. So EC2 instances, the other option is you can use Amazon or another cloud environment to create virtual machines. Certainly, from there, the perspective is that they're easily shared across other users. You can set up, public access to them or limit them to certain networks, so only you and different people in your group can get to them. But you're paying per hour, per minute, really, for the usage of that CPU and disk and everything else, and for transfer fees and things like that. So, if you're going to use EC2, that is kind of the old way of doing shared stuff. You certainly can do it, but for a quick ad hoc engine for people to access, it's one option. You remember, you have to pay for transfer out of and inside of AWS, and you certainly have to know what you're doing in there to not over provision what you're looking for. And you really can't scale it up to multiple users with their own environments very easily by itself without launching multiple VMs yourself. And so that's where a tool like Amazon Workspaces comes in. Let me see if I can bring up a browser with that information on it. Give me 1 second here as I get things rolling. My notes will show up. Who cares? Okay, give me a second. Amazon Workspaces. Right. So this is a really interesting little tool. It gives you remote desktops. It provisions desktops in the cloud for you as a service. Amazon loves to create purpose-driven services that you can access. And so this literally will provision you a desktop environment and give you access to it through a remote desktop tool that they have, an Amazon desktop tool. And the nice thing about this is you can pick the level of CPU and memory and operating system and disk space you need, and then you can set that up and fire it right up and fire up multiple instances, one for each of your team members. It scales cost-wise based on what you're looking for. So if I go to pricing here, you've got either monthly billing if you want to kind of prepay the usage for the instance, or hourly billing for if you want to fire it up as you need it and shut it back down again. One interesting case for this that I found was if you were going to need to get into your development virtual private cloud and do some queries of a database or run some web service calls internally or something that you wanted to do where you wanted to access things behind the virtual firewall. You can use Amazon and take the VPC that is created for your workspaces and peer it with the VPC for your application so that they can see each other, and then you can get to services within the private cloud for your application. Really useful. If we're looking at costs here, they do have a free tier, and the free tier looks like they have a response to COVID-19 value for the free tier. Let me make the font big for that. From April 1st to September 30th, free tier provides up to 50 workspaces, Windows Standard Bundle with 80 gig root and 50 gig user volumes, running an auto stop for up to 10,000 hours of combined use per month across all regions. That is a great deal. So if you were doing something where you needed that, it's potentially available to you. So look into that. If you're curious about experimenting, now would be the right time to give it a shot. And so those are some pieces of information there. You'll see all the different provisos here. You might want to look at those. They have education pricing if you're a college student. And also just in general, let's just kind of take a look at some of these costs. So for example, let's say you're doing some work and you need a Linux instance. So, $21 a month gives you an 80 gig disk with 10 gigs of user storage space, $7.25 a month plus 17 cents an hour for the hourly pricing. If we move over to monthly pricing, hold on, I get confused here. So for hourly pricing, so the deal here is that you will pay that $7.25 a month, but then you only pay 17 cents an hour, and they are generally set up to stop automatically and terminate after I think about an hour or 30 minutes or something like that. So if you need something for casual connection, let's say you're a student and you want to take a tablet with you somewhere, like an iPad. The newer iPads have that docking station with a trackpad even, or you can use a Bluetooth mouse. I've used a Bluetooth mouse against Amazon Workspaces instance, and it's worked fairly well. So you can take an iPad with you and yet still have a full Linux desktop available to you when you want to use it for the 17 cents an hour. That's compelling, plus it's cheaper for students. I think it's $3 cheaper a month. So that's for a very low-end computer. If you're doing simple computer science, that's great. As it scales up, it gets more expensive. But for hourly pricing, it's not the worst. So for example, maybe you do have a hefty project to do, and you want to use a 4 CPU, 16 gig of memory machine, and you want to use it for maybe a day. Well, it's $7.25 a month, 64 cents an hour. Shut it off when you're done, or have it auto shut down, and you can save some money. These come with Linux or they come with Windows. And for enterprises, you can have applications installed through an application manager so that you can kind of have your own controlled desktop and software that you curate for them as well. So that is Amazon Workspaces, which is a really handy little tool there. All right, let's see here. Let's go back to the notes. Now, the next thing is Docker. And if you're using Docker, the goal of Docker is to use small purpose-driven virtual machines. They're kind of single-purpose machines. And the nice part about Docker, as I'm finding in multiple projects in the last year, is that it scales nicely up into the cloud. So I've now been on 2 projects where Docker has been my sole development platform, and I've written code that runs on Docker instances that then get deployed in the cloud. Beyond that, you can certainly use Docker for experiments. You can use Docker for different tools, and it's really useful. You can build your own Docker images. So for example, there's this thing called the Docker file, and it's similar to a provisioning tool like Ansible or Puppet, but you have a virtual environment where you're building by installing pieces of software over each other. So you can start by saying, I want to use a lightweight Linux instance. Then you use an installer like Yum to install Apache. And then on top of Apache, you can install PHP and configure that. And then on top of that, you can then install WordPress, etc. And you can build up your own Docker image. You can also pick them from the Docker images up online on docker.io. And there are tons of those out there as well. You can also orchestrate images together. So for example, Docker Compose lets you set up a stack of, database server, application server, web server, caches and things like that. And you can start it all up with one command. For example, two of our projects now, we've had it such that the production environment is running on AWS. And the production environment uses a database on AWS called RDS. It's a service for offering MySQL, Oracle, Postgres, different things. So the server's sitting out there and it's running on RDS, but then locally you need a database. Now you could install Postgres locally and set it up on your operating system, but it's just as easy to launch a Docker instance, a container for Postgres or for whatever you're interested in, and run your database on Docker. You can even do things like do database migrations and modifications. We use something called Flyway. And Flyway, there's a Docker container from, I forget the name of the company, but they do this Flyway tool, and it connects up to the database and it checks a table and it says, all right, I know that I've gone to this many of the migration SQL changes in your database. I'll pick up where I left off and apply all the additional ones. And so when you do that, you can keep your applications up to date. Another Docker container. You can run Java Docker containers. You can run Python Docker containers, anything you can think of, or install your own. The cons here, or the concerns you'll run into, are things like it's got a pretty beefy learning investment up front. It took me a couple months to really get comfortable with it. Over time, you have to kind of learn the difference between an image and an instance, a container, how to communicate with a container, how to export ports. But there's a lot of materials out there to look at for those kinds of things. And if you're not looking at your pre-baked images, like most software, and we have the same issue in like NPM, for example, but you can find like in node modules, you can find, something that you think is a really good Docker container, but you pull it down and it might be 4 years old and it's not supported by the developer anymore and it has a bunch of vulnerabilities. So whenever you're getting into any of these ecosystems, make sure you take a look and make sure that whatever you're picking has somewhat of a robust, support system for it, and that you can't just do something on your own by building your own container, which might be easier to do. My good friends at Chariot got me some food. I'm grateful. All right. So anyway, let's see. Couple of things also about Docker. Docker can be on Linux and on OS 10, it runs Linux instances because it's on a Linux environment. But if you're on Windows 10, you have a choice to make. So let's say you're on Windows 10 and you're a completely dyed-in-the-wool Microsoft developer. Everything runs on Windows VMs and things like that. You can install Docker to run with Windows as its virtualization. And so if you do that, then you're starting Windows instances. But if you're on a team that does a lot of open source software, you're probably going to want to install the Linux container engine instead. And I'm just going to bring this up because I think it's important. If you're a Windows 10 user and you're up to date, the most recent updates to Windows 10 include a Windows scripting host, WSL, Windows for Software for Linux, or whatever they call that service. Windows WSL 2 is very, very compatible with Docker. In fact, there's a Docker installation option to integrate itself with WSL 2. So the way it works is you install Docker for Windows, you tell it use the Linux containers, then you install WSL2 and say, give me an Ubuntu install. And what Windows will do was will download a Windows 10 compatible kernel for Linux to run in WSL2 and install Ubuntu or whatever Red Hat or whatever instance you want, let you get to your regular file systems, but also give you a full working Linux platform on that shell. You can do all sorts of crazy things. Like you can export X Windows and run an X Windows server or client, I should say, on your desktop and have Windows from inside of the WSL2 instance running Linux operating system software, even IDEs like IDEA. Or you can take a WSL2 literate IDE like Visual Studio Code, install its WSL2 support, and develop right into the Linux distro inside of WSL2. So if you're a Windows developer and you haven't looked at WSL2 and like Visual Studio Code with it and Docker with it, you're missing out. It's really a good development platform. All right, so that kind of leads us to the end of our OS virtualization stuff. What I'd like to talk about for a little bit is another angle. Let's say you're working with a developer, maybe you're mentoring them or you're like brainstorming on an idea. And we all know that the worst place to brainstorm on tech that you might use for a project is in the project itself, because you end up messing up that project quite a bit, right? You always want to kind of learn the feature you're trying to solve if you've never touched it before, kind of in isolation. So it's really good to be able to kick off a quick, virtual development environment in a browser, especially if you're a JavaScript developer. So what I wanted to do now is talk a little bit about, about web-based IDEs. All right, so that's what these are. And I'm going to share my screen again, hopefully. And then I will bring over, it's still there. I will get rid of this because you don't need this anymore. Got to work on this. I'll tell you, my window management technique is terrible. All right, hold on. Okay, web IDEs. Now, let me just make sure I am sharing the screen. Yep, I am. So the first one I'll mention is StackBlitz. StackBlitz is a development tool that came out, I believe, when Angular was building its Angular 2 release, and they were trying to find a documentation tool for it. I believe StackBlitz was the one that they replaced an older tool with. And this is literally an IDE in the web. So if you go to stackblitz.com, I've joined up with my GitHub account to make it easy to kind of save these resources and share them with others. But let's say you wanted to throw up a quick React app. So you click on Create a New Workspace React, and immediately it fires up with a little React repository, and we're all good to go. Anything we change in here, it changes live. Now, this has been around concept-wise for a long time, and so have these tools for a long time. But I want to emphasize how much I use these when I'm teaching people new concepts, because you need something that they can use that's abstracted away from what they're currently doing so they can focus only on what you're trying to show them. And I find that that's a lot better for people to kind of cement the knowledge than just trying to hack in their code. Whenever I'm hacking in someone else's code, even if it's in a throwaway branch, I've got to figure out where we are in that code and how to make the build work. And I don't want to break anything that already works there. So, if you're demoing something, it's good to do it from inside of a tool like this. And you can do things like, go to definition, depending on whether you're lucky enough to pick something that has a definition. Here we go. Maybe I go to hello. It's working great, folks. All right, so much for that one. But also, you can add dependencies. So, for example, we've got React and React DOM. What about Jest? Let's install Jest. So when I type Jest and hit enter, it's doing an npm install in the package.json for you. Notice you have a package.json file, which is really nice. And let's see here. If you want your console, you bring your console up. And so if I want to create a test, let's see, so index.js, jest.js. It's been a while since I've used these tools, so forgive me. So it should do something. And I think I'm doing this wrong, but it doesn't matter. Point being that you've got access to modern JavaScript at this point. Let's make something fail. And it's to .spec.js. It's been a little while, folks. Been working on other things. Spec. There we go. Now, I know that I can get the testing up and running if I do the right thing here, but somehow I just don't have that in the top of my head. Doesn't matter. Let's see here. We also have extensions. This looks a lot like Visual Studio Code. So I believe I can only add those if I have like the commercial version. But bottom line, it's a web IDE, and you can then at the end you can download the project as a zip file, and it has the package JSON in it and everything else, and it works nicely. And you have all sorts of things like color, red. You can immediately start hacking around with the CSS, hacking around with whatever. And there's, you can even do like TypeScript projects from here. Let me just leave here and do a Angular TypeScript project. There we go. So now we're developing in TypeScript. And there's a test. No, it isn't a test. I'm sorry. If this were an actual test, you'd have code that was testable. All right. Anyway, so that's StackBlitz. There's a license fee for it if you want to use it for the full sharing with lots of people and having multiple projects, and so there's a licensed version and a free version. There's also Code Sandbox, and that's been around a little longer. And Code Sandbox is similar. It's got a web IDE. So let me just bring this one up here. Same kind of view of the world. You have the ability to connect into GitHub. You can deploy things. You have, I think it might have a little bit better viewing. Let's see. Definition. Yeah, of course not, but okay. You have your console, same kind of thing. So these are both useful. The big thing here for both of these is the share option, right? So you can share with other developers. This clearly is a licensed feature. You have to go to Code Sandbox Pro if you want to do that. You can embed it in a website. Grab the link to it and then send someone to it. But the bottom line is, if you want to be able to truly share it with somebody and work together, that's a pro license. So that's another web IDE. Another one that was purchased by Amazon a little while back is Cloud9. And what's interesting about Cloud9 is that it involves server side as well. So, I've got here my AWS. Let's see here. I've got a bash environment. So it actually has a virtual machine attached to it, an EC2 instance. And when you detach the instance, it shuts it down. And you can support not only client-side things, but server-side languages. So, for example, here's a simple Java, program, and you have a little bit of code fill-in features in here. In all these, you can, do some IDE stuff. It's not always the best, but you can also have integration and run servers like Node servers and Java servers and things like that. The nice thing about it on AWS is that it automatically gives you your AWS credentials. So you can get in based on the account you launched this as, and you can create S3 buckets. You can use the API from Java or Node or Python or whatever, and you've got an environment ready to go to do that kind of development work. Very, very useful. So if you're looking for more of an interactive environment like that, you can do that. From a sharing perspective, you can let people access it with you, especially on your own Amazon account. I'm not so sure about doing it from the internet. I feel a little scared about that because you have access to your AWS account. But if you've got two people on a team with your particular account and you want to be able to work together on it, you can do that in Cloud9. And so that's another angle for doing things like that. But remember, for all these options that are virtual, that have a server component, you're paying something for them. There is no free lunch for a lot of these tools. You can see that a lot of them need some registration for the higher end sharing, but they're useful tools when you need them. One that is interesting, that is free, that I can tell at least on the outset, is Visual Studio Code. Itself is free, but also they have a Visual Studio Code LiveShare feature that you can install. It's one of the plugins that you have, extensions. And so this gives you the ability at the very bottom, which you probably can't see in a small browser window, but it's bottom left, it's LiveShare. And this will kick off the LiveShare extension, give you a link to the install, I'm sorry, to the session. So I can then come over to a browser. Just going to switch over to the browser here. And it actually launches from the browser link that I gave it. It launches another instance of Visual Studio Code. So if I go over to this one and drag it off screen and I start doing things, let's see here. It worked for me before. Let's see. Yes. So you have the option, for example, to request participants to follow you. So in this thing here, let me see if I can do this. Yes. So actually, I have this flipped around. I have the actual session flipped around with the remote session. So here's the remote session, right? And so I could do things like, start typing in here. Oh, I did have it flipped around. Darn it. Right. So I did have it flipped. It was backwards. I should be playing the Keystone Cops theme at this point. All right. Let's see here. There's also an audio component to this. So you can set it up so that you have the ability to talk to people. So this would be good for teaching people, maybe this is going to be a promise. Oh, and it's in read-only mode because I said read-only. Doesn't matter really. But the bottom line is you can share the screen. You can have other people collaborate on the screen. And as far as I can tell, this particular thing is free. I believe you have to join up with GitHub or a Microsoft account. But beyond that, you've got full ability to do things. Here we go. The remote version. So there's a remote one. So abstract foo data. Right. So, and then someone can jump in, make a comment, do something with it. And you've kind of got this live interaction going on. All right. So that is Visual Studio Code and Visual Studio Code Live. Let me check to see here briefly. All right. So I think we're kind of at the end of this particular session. I had more that I could share, but I think we kind of beat the topic up. But I'm looking for what you might use. So if you watch this video and you have a development tool that you like that you use online, feel free to leave a message on the, leave a comment on the YouTube stream video, and we'll talk about it next week. All right, so that's it. So again, every Tuesday at noon, TechChat. Tuesdays, if you want to leave feedback, I'm at TechCast. And for Cherry Solutions, I'm Ken Rimple. Thank you.